Hello and welcome back to Drilled. I'm Amy Westervelt. For years, literally years, people have been pitching me their excellent books on climate and policy and energy and democracy. And I love all the books and I never have time to read them and do reviews. And I feel terrible about it. So we're changing that over here at Drilled. We've launched a series called Drilling Deep, in which we will be talking to authors about their books. And the hack here is that it won't always be me. In fact, it might never be me, even though I do really enjoy reading them and learning more about them. This week, Adam Lowenstein, who is doing most of these interviews for us, talks to Casey Michel, author of Foreign Agents: How American Lobbyists and Lawmakers Threaten Democracy Around the World. The book was actually published last year, but Michel just wrote a really interesting piece in The Atlantic that kind of updates the thinking from the book for the second Trump administration. Just one quote: "America has never seen corruption like this." Michel's book explored the web of lobbyists, PR gurus, and former politicians who are paid to influence the U.S. government on behalf of foreign regimes. And no surprise here, one of Trump's first moves in office was an executive order stopping enforcement of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Adam had a great conversation with Michel. I hope you enjoy it. Check out the book. We'll link to both the book and the Atlantic piece in the show notes. And we'll see you back here soon for more Drilling Deep.
Cool. Let's get into it.
Yeah.
Good place to start is your recent piece in The Atlantic titled "America Has Never Seen Corruption Like This," which pretty much sums it up. But Let's start with some of the arguments you make in that piece.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Adam. Of course, first things first, thanks for having me back. It's great to reconnect. Of course, as we were just talking off mic, I wish it was under better circumstances, but that's the world that we live in.
Thanks for coming back on. And we left off at an interesting place during the Biden years, and we might get into that a little bit later on.
Yes, the Biden years. I remember those fondly. The past truly is a foreign country. Yeah, look, so the article that I have in The Atlantic that you mentioned just the other day was not pegged to any one news development, any one revelation, any one exposure, or any one international corruption network. It was trying to survey the field of the last 6 months or so, now that we're about 6 months into the new administration, of just how, frankly, historic the scope and the scale of the corruption emanating from and running through the White House, and of course the broader kind of world of Trump affiliates and the Trump family, and of course the Trump organization truly is. What I have found on my end is maybe not the most effective thing, but one effective thing that I found on my end in my writing is trying to examine historic parallels, such as they are throughout predominantly American history, of networks, of valences, of stories of corruption, almost all of which throughout the predominance of American history have been domestic. Donald Trump is by no means the first president or the first administration that has been embroiled in corruption scandals. I laid out at the outset of the piece itself that go back to the days of Ulysses S. Grant and his family members and inner circles, his cabinet. Go back to the days of Warren Harding and Teapot Dome. Of course, go back to the days of Richard Nixon and Watergate, even though that is predominantly remembered as a political story, which it absolutely was. There's also a story of rank corruption, especially corporate corruption, regarding linkages with the White House. And that's all true. Those are all scandals unto themselves. Of course, Teapot Dome for nearly a century was kind of the shorthand for presidential corruption. But what we have seen over the last 5-6 months now, it blows all of that out of the water. There really is no historic comparison for the scope, the scale, and of course the speed with which all of this has happened itself. And you can talk about specific incidents of it. You can talk, of course, about the Qatari jet, the $400 million luxury liner gifted from a foreign dictatorship directly to a sitting president. You can talk about the crypto and the meme coins. Of course, you could talk about the Trump organization itself. That's all perfectly true. That's all beyond anything we've ever seen before. But you could also talk about the policy developments and how the administration has really taken an absolute sledgehammer to whatever kind of anti-corruption bona fides the U.S. once had. Going all the way back maybe 50 years or so in the post-Watergate era is when you can really begin to examine the rise of this kind of anti-corruption regime or these anti-corruption policies. Almost all of those have been completely decimated, either unenforced, completely dissolved in terms of some task forces, no resourcing for actual investigations themselves. And of course, what we've seen take place at the Department of Justice with the clear quid pro quo in terms of dropping certain prosecutions, including against our beloved mayor here in New York City, who was allegedly going around the world, especially in places like Turkey, and asking for campaign financing, which was, of course, the reddest of red lines. I mean, Adam, look, I could talk to you, and maybe we will talk for a full hour about all of the developments out of
that is sort of the plan.
That's about the Trump administration. But it was an exercise in trying to get all of this into one single article. I still left plenty of material on the chopping block, right? I don't think I mentioned once, maybe I mentioned in passing, the role and relationships of Jared Kushner and the billions of dollars that the president's son-in-law has brought in from dictatorship after dictatorship, as far as anyone can tell, only because he is, of course, the son-in-law of a sitting president. I mean, that's just one figure among many that I had to leave out of this article. The list goes on and on and on.
One of the things you mention in that Atlantic piece is the Foreign Corrupt Practice Act. Can you talk about what that law is or was and what it means for the Trump administration to stop enforcing it?
The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, it's known by its acronym, the FCPA, and that's what I'll generally refer to it as. This was really the bedrock of America's anti-corruption statutes or policies going back nearly 50 years. I talked a moment ago about Watergate and the aftermath of Watergate and the revelations therein. And again, it wasn't just about a burglary at the Watergate Hotel. It wasn't just about the lengths that Richard Nixon would go to remain in power. As congressional investigators discovered, there were any number of leading American corporations secretly bankrolling Richard Nixon's re-election campaign in 1972. Again, this was contravening all manner of campaign finance law back in the 1970s. But it wasn't just that. It was also that many of these companies were going around the world and bribing corrupt officials in places like Japan and South Korea, places like the Netherlands, but also places like Saudi Arabia, and finding corrupt regimes, corrupt officials that they could pay off to open the doors for American business and American commerce. And of course, keep those regimes in power for as long as they wanted as well. And when these revelations came out, right, we're talking tens, hundreds of millions of dollars, significant amounts of money. When these revelations came out, it wasn't just a scandal that American companies are going around the world and bribing, autocratic regimes in places like Honduras. It is also that when those revelations came out, all of a sudden, all manner of anti-American forces and political parties and movements could point to those regimes and point to those American companies and say, look at what is happening. Look at what the U.S. is doing, what it is allowing, and look at what these American companies are doing in terms of smothering any kind of democracy, again, in places like the military dictatorship, South Korea, autocracy in Honduras, so on and so on. It's funny, I was rereading this earlier this morning, some of the congressional testimony. Some of the biggest benefactors of all of these revelations were things like communist parties. Again, remember the 1970s, near the height of the Cold War, and all of a sudden the communists can point to officials in Italy or the Netherlands or wherever it is and say, look at just how corrupt the Americans and their lackeys in power here are. So that's all kind of a long-winded way of setting the stage for what legislators ended up doing in 1977, realizing just how damaging this was to American policies and American foreign policy especially. They passed this thing called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is really, and I want to make sure to kind of convey just how monumental this was. This wasn't just the first time in American history that it was now a crime for American corporations or American businessmen to bribe foreign officials. This was the first time anywhere had ever passed anything like this. The first time in global history, any country had made it a crime to engage in bribery, not in that country and specifically, but a foreign country in and of itself. So again, what the FCPA does is it makes it illegal for any American company, any American business person, or any foreign company that's listed on an American stock exchange, even if they're not technically American companies themselves, to engage in bribery abroad in any country around the world. And this was 1977. This was nearly 50 years ago. And that's really, again, I used the term earlier, kind of the bedrock from where we saw over the ensuing decades, all of these other anti-corruption policies really stem from. That really declared American leadership in this space. We eventually saw it replicated in places like Canada, the European Union, United Kingdom, but also really set the kind of the baseline for where American anti-corruption policy would go from there. So then eventually you had things like shell company transparency. Eventually you had things like new task forces dedicated to targeting and seizing and returning dirty money. Of course, you had the Department of Justice prosecuting all around the world corrupt networks. Again, that was a long-winded way of saying the FCPA was wonderful. And technically, it is still on the books. But in one of the very first things that Donald Trump did in returning to the presidency was announce, effectively, it was no longer going to be enforced. As he saw it, it was a, quote, horror show of a law that prevented American businesses from engaging in routine business practices abroad and damaging American competitiveness, which is just a nice little euphemistic way of saying American companies and American businessmen should be able to bribe whoever they want without being concerned, without being worried about prosecution from the Department of Justice. It was devastating to see. It was a monumental, even generational setback. The silver lining is it's still on the books, and a potential future administration could, of course, begin reinforcing it. But it was a very clear sign of the direction this administration was going to go in.
That raises an important distinction, which is the direction of travel, the direction of corrupt travel, I guess, which is the FCPA focuses on American companies illegally or unlawfully or unethically influencing governments around the world. Your book, Foreign Agents, which we talked about last year, focuses on sort of the reverse direction of corruption. Obviously, it's all interrelated, but focuses on the governments, authoritarian regimes around the world hiring U.S. officials, politicians, influencers of various kinds who have access to the U.S. government and can shape American policy. What is the state of the corrupt union when it comes to foreign influence on the United States?
The state of affairs right now is, I don't know, terrible, terrifying, unsettling.
Yes, it depends if you are making money or not.
Well, sure. It depends on what kind of line of work you're in, and I suppose what kind of morals, if any, you have about, or scruples, I should say, about working with some of the most heinous regimes around the world. Again, just as a little bit of context, I know, Adam, you and I spoke about this in the past. In the United States of America, it's not illegal. It's perfectly legal for you or I or any other American to go lobby on behalf of not only any cause that we want, but any regime that we want. You and I can right now go talk to our legislators about how actually wonderful the regime in Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates or Gabon or Venezuela or whatever it is might be. That's predominantly because in the First Amendment, we have the right to petition the government for redress of grievances, which is just an old-timey way of saying lobbying. You and I can go lobby for whatever cause we want. That is not illegal. All Americans have to do is register their work. If they're being paid to do that by these foreign governments, they just have to register with the Department of Justice and declare what they're doing and disclose how much they're making and so on and so forth. And you and I can go online to the Department of Justice website and take a look through that database of all of these American lobbyists who are selling themselves to regime after regime around the world. And again, as you just laid out, it's not even just traditional lobbyists, right? These kind of traditional lobbying firms in DC. It's PR specialists, it's consultants, it's, of course, many former members of Congress or of cabinet or previous administrations themselves. It is, a whole kind of constellation of American industries are now congealing within the one broader umbrella industry of foreign lobbying. And because of Donald Trump's first term, again, this is now a multi-billion-dollar industry itself. These are extremely effective lobbyists. These are extremely effective networks at implementing policies that these foreign regimes want to see implemented. And again, it's things like arms sales, it's things like the lifting or prevention of sanctions. It's even things, and we were talking about this off mic in terms of climate, it's even things like fast tracking energy policies that benefit hydrocarbon producers and pushing off or gutting green or clean tech reforms that, again, places like China or Azerbaijan or Saudi Arabia, the major oil producers, do not want to see pursued. It's been extremely effective. Because of Donald Trump's first term, there was kind of a rising salience about some of these threats, because it's not just that they're lobbying officials. what a lot of folks realize is that these lobbyists were really enmeshing themselves in the highest levels of American policy making, in many ways crafting American foreign policy that should have been crafted by American legislators or those in the White House, but instead was being directed by these foreign lobbyists themselves. And Adam, I can't remember when you and I spoke last, but I believe it was after, maybe right around the same time as the conviction of former Senator Bob Menendez, who was, before his conviction, was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the most powerful member of American Congress in terms of crafting American foreign policy.
And a Democrat, which bears emphasizing in this
Yes,
moment.
he is one of the leaders, was one of the leaders for a long time of the Democratic Party. And as we also learned recently, was secretly moonlighting, conspiring to act as the jury found him guilty of, a foreign agent for the military dictatorship in Egypt. He was secretly lobbying his colleagues in the Senate, secretly ghostwriting on behalf of his patrons back in Cairo. And he was the first American member of Congress to be convicted on these charges and was recently sentenced, and if I remember correctly, is actually now in prison on a very lengthy stay for, again, acting as secretly a foreign lobbyist on behalf of not his constituents back in New Jersey, but the military dictatorship back in Egypt. So again, this is just all kind of a little bit of the scope and scale of what we see on the foreign lobbying side. Fast forward to where we are right now, the current administration saying, no, we're not going to enforce any of these foreign lobbying laws. We're only going to target those that are engaged in traditional espionage. If a foreign agent, a foreign lobbyist is somehow, some way getting a hold of classified information and sending it back to their patrons and benefactors elsewhere, we will prosecute that. But if they're not disclosing who they're working for, if they're not sharing with the American public who's actually paying them, we're not going to prosecute that whatsoever. So it really seems like, and again, it's going to take years to really figure out the breadth of this, very much seems like we're back in the golden era, back in a golden age of these kind of foreign lobbying networks being able to operate in the shadows without the rest of us having any idea what they're actually doing.
I wanted to ask you about what the state of the influence industry in Washington is right now. Because on one hand, and as you just referenced, there's tons of money to be made from foreign governments seeking influence, sway, access to the Trump administration. What I wondered, though, is on the other hand, is the fact that the administration is so shameless in some ways, or the fact that Trump himself is such a, as has been widely reported, makes decisions based on who talks to him most recently, who flatters him the most, whatever. Does that make it harder for some of the traditional levers of influence in Washington to do their work? Because I feel like they at least sell themselves as having access that the average person doesn't have. But if you can get access to the decider through Fox News, then does that mean you don't need to hire Brownstein or whomever?
It's funny, Adam, and far be it for me to feel any kind of bad about any of these figures. But yes, there was, even through Trump's first term and certainly well into the Biden era, there was a playbook that they had followed for years and years and years, for decades. And it was an extension of, an outgrowth of what traditional lobbying for domestic causes looked like, right? It was the kind of the backroom conversations. It was having one-on-one meetings. It was, in some cases, donating directly to a member of Congress's or even a presidential candidate's election or re-election campaigns. I mean, again, it's there was no real kind of secret sauce to any of it. It was about who you knew and who you could access and what kind of doors you could open. And now what we see with Donald Trump's second term is that playbook certainly still exists. And of course, much of it does come down to, at the end of the day, who these figures know and what doors they can open. But the range of tactics and tools now available has just been blown out of the water. Again, to get back to what we were talking about a few moments ago, I never in 1,000 years thought I would ever see the day that a foreign regime, in this case out of Qatar, would be able to gift a $400 million luxury liner airplane to a sitting president, and yet here we are. I never thought I would see a world in which a sitting president has direct access to not only the so-called meme coins, but of course is more than willing and more than happy to host these effective pay-to-play dinners for both Americans and non-Americans alike, those who have given or invested the most amount of money in a specific crypto venture. And of course, I never thought that I would actually see, I should have had an idea with Trump's first term, but I never thought I would actually see the day where a sitting president has his real estate company gallivanting around the world and signing up deals in dictatorship after dictatorship, foreign country after foreign country. I mean, this is all just unprecedented, completely uncharted waters, as we talked about earlier, completely without any kind of historic precedent. And I don't know how traditional lobbying firms are adapting. But I do think it is indicative that one of the key figures that has opened up Donald Trump to the world of crypto and crypto related investments is someone who emerged from that traditional lobbying world, and that is our old friend Paul Manafort, who was Donald Trump's first campaign manager in 2016, helped launch him to the presidency, eventually jailed on foreign lobbying charges, and then pardoned by Trump, and now in the last year or two has emerged as this key player in the crypto space that we know from other reporting has led Donald Trump directly into that space and, of course, opened up all manner of new areas of influence. So there's a Manafort is many things, but there is a certain skill set that he brings to bear in terms of opening up avenues of influence.
What are the currencies of influence these days? You mentioned crypto being a big one. There's been some reporting about, the Saudi government, among others, really going all in on AI and data centers. Yeah. To woo the administration and its tech oligarch backers. But what are they trafficking in these days?
Well, I mean, look, at the barest element of explanation is money, right? It's whatever means of financing directly into the American president's pocket, his family's pockets, his business's pockets, his allies' pockets. It's whatever the vehicle of value is. And if that's opening up a new resort in Vietnam, Trump resort in Vietnam, so be it. If that is spending $300 million or investing $300 million on a Trump meme coin so you can have dinner with the president, so be it. If that is an investment fund in the United Arab Emirates agreeing that it will exchange or participate in exchanges using that Trump meme coin or whatever the other crypto venture is, so be it. I mean, it's funny that you mentioned AI. This is actually a space I don't think has gotten nearly enough attention, both because of not only the developments in the space in and of itself and the implications of either domestic or especially foreign investment in artificial intelligence, but it's a very clear direction that especially the Saudis and the Emiratis have gone in. And I don't remember I don't have the figures off the top of my head, but the most recent visit from or agreement between President Trump and Gulf partners is hundreds of millions of dollars in Gulf investment in artificial intelligence, opening up of data centers, and of course providing leverage from these regimes themselves over whether it's American AI companies themselves or American AI policy writ large. Again, there's no admiration whatsoever, but you do have to comment on the relative savvy, I suppose, of figures like MBS in Saudi Arabia or MBZ in the United Arab Emirates, realizing which way the wind is blowing, and of course realizing that there are all manner of tech oligarchs surrounding Donald Trump and his presidency and more than willing to back him come hell or high water, and then opening up these new streams of investment from these dictatorships elsewhere. I mean, look, it's one investment vehicle after another. And it's funny, I will say, you and I are speaking here on July 22nd, and just yesterday, the administration announced that it is going to be, charitably kicking the can down the road about new anti-money laundering rules and regulations for American private equity and venture capital and hedge funds. These were anti-money laundering policies that were supposed to be implemented back in the early 2000s, but because of a so-called temporary loophole, just have never been implemented. And the Biden administration announced finally they were going to require these private investment funds, again, that manage total trillions, if not tens of trillions of dollars, to just check where that money is coming from and flag any concerns for the American government, for the federal government. And what we saw yesterday is the new administration, the Treasury Department, announcing, no, we're not going to pursue those rules and regulations. We're going to open it up for discussion. We're going to reconsider. And in the meantime, all these private investment funds will be able to have an absolute feast and open their doors to anyone and everyone they want, foreign regimes, foreign oligarchs, proxies, what have you. and injecting all of that money and all of that wealth into the American economy and throughout the American economy without any kind of transparency, any kind of due diligence in this whatsoever. And, we talked a moment ago about Jared Kushner. And it's funny because, he left the first administration without any private investment, private equity experience whatsoever. He was a, let's call it, struggling real estate developer before he joined Trump's first White House. And then he left and almost immediately began taking in billions of dollars for his own private investment fund from the Saudis, from the Emiratis, from the Qataris, without any kind of experience, any kind of reason to believe that those investments would be successful in terms of returning capital back to those regimes. But, I don't want to cast aspersions, but it certainly looks like it's going in one direction in terms of influence and in terms of access to the man that is now the son-in-law of the sitting president. And again, that's just one figure and one fund on the private investment side among a whole slew of others that are still open and available to anyone and everyone.
It is remarkable how much money these regimes have access to and how desperate they seem to be to find anywhere to invest it. And most of it comes from oil, which I think is not new in the sense that it's not breaking news, but also bears emphasizing, given some of these regimes at the same time at least are maintaining the facade of transitioning their economies and participating in global climate negotiations, transitioning their economies away from oil. But at the same time, all of this money is related to the extraction and production of fossil fuels, and it finally has somewhere to go. I'd be curious what you think of this. It seems like any reason for which a Western investor or investment fund manager might have had for not accepting that money, any compunction, I guess is the word, no longer exists. Is that a fair way to put it? There's really no shame associated with taking that money anymore.
No, there's no shame, there's no compunction, there's no reason, and there's no even structural incentive to say no. Not only because you should have extremely minimal concern about any kind of investigation or prosecution so long as you remain in the current administration's good graces, but also because if you do say no, then your competitor down the street will say yes, or if they don't say yes, then some other competitor will end up opening their doors. And again, this is a dynamic we have seen elsewhere. It's a dynamic that does predate the current president. It's something that we saw in the lobbying industry writ large. It's something that we saw in the consulting industry, in particular, in working with regimes like Saudi Arabia. I know you can look at oil producing regime after oil producing regime around the world. You can look at Russia, you can look at Equatorial Guinea, you can look at Libya, you can certainly look at Azerbaijan or Kazakhstan. But of course, the one that we mentioned already a few times is Saudi Arabia. And it is breathtaking, and I hope there are multiple books coming out about it in the very near future to see the scope and the breadth of opportunities that Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund has opened up for the regime. And of course, almost all of that money, if not all of it, coming from the production of oil and the broader climate destruction therein. Because it's funny, because if you go back to 2018, 2019, after the assassination of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, Saudi Arabia and MBS in particular, they weren't exactly persona non grata, but they were having lobbying clients, consulting clients, even investors in Silicon Valley and elsewhere in the U.S. turn them away and turn them down.
Right.
And say, we will not have any business. We will not be seen to be doing any business with this regime. And again, you want to talk about the past being a foreign country. And that was only 6-7 years ago. I can't even fathom getting to that point. Again, I have no idea what the Saudi regime would have to do to get to that point once more where American lobbying shops, American investors are turning down Saudi money, because you can just cast around the American economy, whether it's in Hollywood, whether it is in the sports industry, especially things like golf or tennis or boxing. I'm sure at some point down the line, the NBA and the NFL will be opening themselves up to Saudi money. I hope to God it's not my beloved Portland Trailblazers who are currently for sale, and I live in dread that the Saudis will be the ones to purchase them. Or of course, again, all of the image management shops, or even things like Twitter or X, right? It's just a bottomless list of industries that have opened themselves up to investments from the regime, or opened themselves up to the private investment, the private equity, hedge fund, and venture capital firms that have opened themselves to Saudi financing itself. And again, it's not just Kushner; it's the Andreessen Horowitzes of the world. I mean, it really is the biggest names across industry after industry that are now being bankrolled directly by, or at least indirectly via these private investment funds, Saudi wealth. That oil money that the Saudis now have, and I think they're going to pass the 1 trillion mark shortly if they haven't already, for the private investment fund. And again, this is just one regime of many that are realizing, oh, in the United States of America, it is now the golden era of white collar crime, right? The crime wave is here. It is just white collar, as another writer, Jacob Silverman, wrote in his new book. And it's not going to end anytime soon.
That gets at the thing that seems most profound in some ways. There's obviously the scale of the literal corruption, as we've talked about, but there's also just the sense of shame that used to be associated with it. And this comes to mind when you mentioned the years following the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And there was at least a pretense that companies were turning away from doing business with a regime that would murder journalists.
Yeah.
There was always an element of performance there because they were clearly hungry for that money and got back in as soon as they could. But what feels different about certainly the last 6 months, but even the last couple of years, is just how quickly that pretense has faded, or at least the sense that they need to keep up that performance. And there's just been sort of a collective shrug in some ways because it's just too much.
Yeah.
And I wonder what you make of that.
Again, charitably, if you just pull back and examine the kind of incentive structures that these firms, these industries writ large are engaging in, there is a reality that if they have a fiduciary responsibility to shareholders, or if they just have any kind of general profit-driven motive, yes, morals are great, but if you're not committing any crime and you don't have to be concerned about any prosecution, then all you're doing is ceding ground to your competitors who have fewer scruples than you, or maybe who knows, maybe they have just as many scruples as you, but also can read the landscape and realize that if they don't do this, if they don't make that kind of first mover step, then someone else will. And you can look at this from a lot of different vantages. You can look at this from the perspective of people who are hired as representatives of these regimes, saying, "Oh, I'm actually a good guy. I'm going to put this money to good use. And of course, if I'm inside the tent rather than outside, it can make more of a difference." You can look at it geopolitically. I remember, of course, I guess he was then a candidate, Joe Biden, saying we're going to make Saudi Arabia a pariah nation, pariah status. And it was, 2 months, 3 months into his first term where he's there fist bumping MBS itself.
And asking for more oil production.
Of course, the American-Saudi partnership has decades and decades behind it at this point. And I will say, it's funny, and I don't remember if we talked about this last time, but there's a chapter of the book, of the Foreign Agents book, which quotes one of these lobbyists from back in the early 1990s, who was working for people like Saddam Hussein or the then dictator in places like Liberia. I mean, truly the world's worst. And someone asked him about it. He said, well, look, it's at the end of the day, it's just money. And as he said, shame is for sissies. That was his quote. And that's what ended up being one of the chapter titles. And I think that is an ethos that was maybe a little ahead of its time, because that is certainly something that we see every single day. I mean, there is no, if there ever was, space for or consideration of something like shame. Every day it appears an outdated phenomenon and term. And that's too bad, because shame can be a wonderful tool in the right hands.
Yeah. Sometimes the only tool we have too.
Yeah, it is. It is funny because this is what does the kind of ethos of the first foreign lobbying regulations was. Look, we're not going to ban this. This is all the way back in the 1930s when they were exposed as working for the Nazis and the Soviets and Mussolini. We can't ban this, but if we bring it to light, bring some transparency, we can shame these Americans into no longer working with these regimes. And rarely has that worked. Again, it's one thing that's been very nice in theory, but when you talk about the kind of money involved in practice, it is very rare.
I wanted to ask you, and this might be a hot take that's not worth taking, but it's not a leading question. I'm genuinely curious what you think. If there's anything to be celebrated is too strong of a word. if there is a silver lining of some kind, in the sense that the Trump regime is doing a lot of this stuff so clumsily and shamelessly and publicly. And a lot of this stuff has been going on, again, to a lesser extent, but as you've pointed out in the book and as we've talked about previously, has been going on for decades. Just now it's happening in the open because there's no sense of consequence or shame associated with it. Is there anything to be celebrated about that fact, that people can actually see what's sort of always happened?
Yeah, I mean, the silver lining is it's impossible to escape this. You cannot push it away. It's there in your news feed every single day. It is overwhelming. It is breathtaking. And it forces you to consider, how is it that this is happening? Why is it that this is happening? And of course, the secondary question is, okay, well, if these policies were in place before Trump and he can simply use them to his advantage or trample them underfoot, what does that mean for a potential future administration? If we do want to shore up, if we can possibly shore up America's kind of anti-corruption, counter-kleptocracy regime itself. And it's funny because I'm working on the next book that I'm working on is looking at the rise of this oligarchic class in the United States of America and how that oligarchic class has transformed into not only threats domestically in terms of American democracy, but also begun allying with foreign regimes themselves that have no interest in restoring things as simple as American democracy. And one of the things that I'm hoping to do with this book is examine the kind of lessons and the periods of previous successful reforms. There's two primary ones. There's the 1900, 1910 broader progressive era, really linked to the Teddy Roosevelt administration. There were other, of course, players involved. And that was the aftermath of the Gilded Age, which was the first kind of really true oligarchic class and the kind of threats therein. And that resulted in all kinds of things, right? Successful prosecutions, of course, antitrust mobilization and crackdowns, but also campaign finance reforms. Because there's one thing that we haven't talked about yet today, and that's campaign finance and the role and legacy of things like Citizens United in further distorting and in many ways, I mean, degrading, maybe not quite destroying to the point yet American democracy, but really taking again a sledgehammer to any kind of sanctity or sovereignty of American democracy. You go back to the progressive era and mine some lessons there. And then the other one we've already talked about, which is the post-Watergate era. And that was the creation, not only the FCPA, but even the Federal Election Commission, which is, again, one of those things that on paper looks like it would have been fantastic, but very quickly fell apart. And what kind of lessons can we mine therein? So, yes, it's a silver lining, and it's tough to see those silver linings when you're in the middle of such a dark cloud as this one. But yeah, if you get your binoculars and you peer pretty far, sure, you can see it out there.
One of the things we talked about last time was the bipartisan history of foreign influence peddling, and we had talked about how, weirdly, one of the good, positive, small baby steps that the Trump administration, the first one, had taken was requiring disclosure of foreign funding for U.S. universities and U.S. think tanks, and how the Biden administration had essentially stopped enforcing that. Have there been any developments on either of those fronts since?
No, there haven't.
Next question.
This is look, there's plenty of disappointing things to see in the past few months, and one of them is this inability to build on even these small victories we have seen. No, there has not been any progress in terms of think tank disclosure and in terms of university disclosure. Not that can't change. I wouldn't be surprised if we see increasing investigations and transparency requirements for American universities, perhaps not for the best reasons.
Right.
But I don't know, because one of the things that the Trump administration wants to do is completely abolish the Department of Education, which is the one that houses all of the transparency data about how American universities have been taking in tens of millions, hundreds of millions, in some cases billions of dollars from authoritarian regimes around the world in terms of gifts and contracts. And if they eliminate the Department of Education, then that goes out the window. So yeah, sorry, Adam, I don't have good news on.
Well, here's one more shot at finding good news. Was a headline or some reporting that the Wall Street Journal has done over the last couple of months about the General Services Administration, which tellingly is now run by a former KKR private equity fund executive, but requiring or demanding of consulting giants like McKinsey and BCG, Accenture, my former employer EY, and others to basically justify their huge federal contracts. I wonder what you make of that effort, whether it's sort of just a anti-quote-unquote woke, anti-DEI effort, or if it actually there's some substance to telling consulting firms to justify these billions of dollars worth of taxpayer contracts.
I would think that if anyone is well placed to justify billions of dollars of contracts, it would be these consulting firms.
Yeah, they'll find a way.
They'll find a way. Of course, in theory, there's nothing wrong, right? It's like Doge, right? In theory, yes, of course, we should root out fraud and waste and abuse, and yes, of course, American taxpayer dollars should be used for the to the furthest extent they can for the minimum amount. But that's all fine in theory. Of course, seeing this in practice for reasons that maybe they stem from DEI considerations and quote unquote anti-woke considerations. Maybe there was just someone at BCG or McKinsey or whomever that caught the ire of someone who has Trump's ear. Like I don't know what is actually leading this push itself. I mean, I will say, of course, I have no love lost for any of these firms, many
Right.
of these firms, maybe a few of them. And again, something you and I have talked about in the past is how many of these firms, McKinsey, Teneo, Boston Consulting Group, have worked for regimes like Saudi Arabia, and again, opened up the U.S. to any number, all manner of Saudi influence, as well as plenty of other regimes around the world. And the one that comes to mind recently, and it was the Financial Times that did this great reporting on how Boston Consulting Group had been involved, or at least a number of senior partners had been involved in euphemistically creating exit packages for Palestinians from Gaza to effectively whitewash Israeli ethnic cleansing campaigns. So no, when it comes to the Trump administration and some of these consulting firms, please don't ask me who I'm rooting for.
Yeah.
But we'll see what comes.
I suspect they'll all find a way to win at everyone else's expense as they typically do.
Yes, I think that's fine.
The BCG in Gaza contracts were so revealing in the sense that one of the things you talk about in your book, Foreign Agents, is the work that Ivy Lee, the quote unquote father of public relations, did for the Nazi regime. And you can draw a direct line from that type of work in the 1930s to the type of work that BCG has been reportedly doing in the 2020s. And it's the same playbook with different actors, different sums of money.
Yeah. As Ivy Lee saw it, Adolf Hitler was bringing stability to one of the key economic and national, nations in Europe. He was a bulwark against far left communism emanating from the Soviet Union. And at the end of the day, if the Americans didn't partner with him, then other regimes who are maybe opposed to American interests would partner with him. And don't we want to get in on the ground floor? Don't we want to at least hear what he has to say? And yes, maybe he has his foibles, and maybe there are some concerns about what's happening domestically. But look, a lot of that is just rhetoric. We don't really need to be concerned about what Adolf Hitler is doing in Germany or in Europe. And you can find a way to justify if you want. And certainly if you are being paid, you can find a way to justify almost anything. And it has been remarkable to watch Boston Consulting Group try to scramble to explain away how multiple senior partners were involved in ethnic cleansing or greenlighting ethnic cleansing or spinning ethnic cleansing. And it's just a very short step from there to outright genocide. And I have no doubt that there are at least some folks in some of these firms that have already considered what are the best talking points if we do see a genocide emerge wherever it is, right? Whether it's in Palestine or Myanmar or Sudan. There's money to be made, and if we don't make it, our competitors will. And at the end of the day, who needs shame anyway?
There was a pattern that played out during the first Trump administration of, because Trump and his administration were so, corrupt, outrageous, offensive, crude, that companies could essentially step into the breach and be the benevolent, sane, competent actors in society. That was, I think, part of what drove the rise of so-called ESG and corporate sustainability and all this stuff, which has been a trend. That was not the first time companies had pretended to save the world. They tend to do this when they're facing a lot of backlash. And I wonder if you've seen that same pattern play out again this time, if they're trying to step in and say, he's off the rails, but we got this, or if they're more like, we're just going to ride that wave and cash in.
Well, I mean, I guess I'd be keen for your perspective. I certainly haven't seen any indication of that. And again, I think it's it's multifold. One, we are only 6 months into the new administration. Who knows where we'll be a year from now? Who knows what will happen after the
Right.
midterms? And of course, who knows what will actually be taking place in the final year of this second term? And two, we've seen how aggressive the current administration is about swatting down or suffocating, or whatever term you'd like to use, private interests that may be opposed to the current administration, using the power of the state to specifically target any and all private organizations, maybe most spectacularly in media with Paramount and the ABC settlements, that would even think about speaking out about the current administration. Adam, what do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a more optimistic take, that's for sure. It does feel like they got their tax cut in 2017, end of 2017, so they kind of got what they wanted from the administration. And then those next couple of years, it was kind of, it seemed like they either saw an opportunity or felt an obligation to at least pretend that they were the adults in the room.
Yeah.
They were the serious people when Trump was off the rails, even if they shared ultimately the same economic goals. And I agree. Now it feels like either they're too afraid to do that, but I think more realistically, they're not interested in doing that performance anymore because they feel like they don't have to.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, look, the big beautiful bill just passed a few weeks ago. Of course, those many of those tax cuts we saw in 2017 are now permanent. Again, at a very what we were talking about earlier, maybe a macro level, right? There is no concern about any kind of white collar prosecution. There's no concern about any kind of
Right.
fraud prosecution. There's no concern about, of course, foreign bribery prosecution. I mean, and again, white collar crime is wide open right now as long as you stay in the good graces of the administration. The only time that we saw any kind of outspoken concerns from leaders within the private industry space was after I guess it was April, if I remember correctly, the first, what was it, Liberation Day, right? The announcement of
Liberation
what
Day,
these
yeah.
tariffs were going to look like, and of course the shudder that sent through private industry that did become more outspoken about their concerns about what the administration was doing. And I wonder if they can argue to themselves that it seems like, oh, okay, it was those concerns that pushed these tariffs kind of off into the future, and we were able to sway President Trump. As far as I could tell, it was just the bond markets, as Trump said, getting jumpy or yippy, whatever the term was, that dissuaded him. And clearly, tariffs, at least the discussion of them, have not gone anywhere. Every single day, it seems like there's a new proposal, there's a new announcement, there's a new postponement, so on and so forth. And I know, of course, I don't know how all of this is going to end, but I especially don't know if or what a breaking point would look like for private industry regarding at least the tariff conversation. And I don't know if there is one, given how the administration has used the power of the state thus far to target its opponents.
And it's not like there aren't opportunities in tariffs to raise prices. We saw that almost immediately where, even before tariffs had taken effect or on industries that weren't affected by it, they were saying we have to raise our prices because of tariffs. And it's sort of like what they did with inflation a couple of years ago, where, it's an opportunity to get away with price increases at the very least.
It degrades quality of life for the rest of us. It makes things harder, it makes things more expensive. And if Trump, being the political savant that he has apparently been over the last decade, is able to distance himself sufficiently from those price increases and for goods and services, I wouldn't put it past him. And of course, if private industry is not unified in speaking out, or at least sufficiently unified in speaking out against this, I look forward to decades of decline with you, Adam, and commiserating over silver linings.
There's our silver lining.
But can't quite get it. Boy, that was a depressing comment. I'm sorry.
I mean, it's realistic.
Yeah.
Actually, related to that, I wanted to ask you how you're sort of personally, as a human being covering this stuff right now, how you are processing this time in history.
On my most optimistic days, it is what we were talking about earlier, trying to convince myself that this is a period similar to what we saw in the 1880s, 1890s, and similar to what we saw in the late 1960s, early 1970s in terms of not only things like wealth inequality or corporate sway and lording over American politics, but of course abuse of power, especially out of the executive office itself. Now no historic parallel is exactly parallel. Of course, this era is completely different in so many ways, but it is trying to find a historic resonance that gives me reason to believe that there is, to use an overused image, a pendulum swing in the offing coming in the near future. And on my most optimistic days, that is what I like to consider. And of course, it's going to be part of the book itself. Now, on my most pessimistic days, it is simply the reality and the notion that all empires fall. And the United States of America has always been and continues to be an empire, in some cases in the most literal sense, with any number of territories that we still have not yet elevated to statehood. But of course, the kind of entangling of corporate finance within American elections and American campaigns, and the reduction of any kind of American democratic input from American voters and the American populace. And this isn't even considering things like the fiscal crisis that is now even further staring us down the pipeline at some point in the not too distant future. So I swing between those depending on the day. And I know we talked about media diet a little bit off the mic, but I will say one thing that gets me through this. You can see a stack of Batman comics behind me. That always helps. But also just reading widely on things that have nothing to do with American history, or in some cases, nothing to do with history whatsoever. It is, you got to have those mental health breaks. You can't
sure.
just be following the news all day long, or you'd probably die.
It's I too am finding a lot of solace in books, and specifically almost less the subject matter in some cases, and more the analog print book where there are no links, there are no ads, there's no breaking news. I know it wasn't written by an algorithm. There's sort of a hard separation from the reality of the world. And I will actually say the version of the world that comes through the media is not the whole reality. This is not some, raging against the fake news media or whatever, but there is obviously an algorithmic bias toward outrage, and there is a rebalancing, I feel like, whether it's a graphic novel or a comic or just a print book, that helps me reset a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. And look, I'm going to put my old man hat on and
that's my favorite hat.
say, yeah, I have to read analog books, right? I mean, I don't have a Kindle, I don't have a Nook, right? I have a pen and I have my book. And that's how I do. And of course, this is one of the benefits of reading history, is realizing that, the sky has been falling for every nation for centuries, for millennia, so on and so on and so on. And who knows, maybe we'll get through this or maybe we won't, but much of it is beyond our control. And you try to do your good work where you can, you try to make a difference where you can, and you try to spend time with people that you care about and who care about you in turn. Let me ask you, Adam, have you read any good books recently, either fiction, nonfiction?
I have read lots of good books. I was actually rereading just the other day There Are No Children Here by Alex Kotlowitz.
Sure, yeah.
It's I
have not read that one, but yeah, I'm familiar. Yeah.
I think it came out in 1991, but Kotlowitz, who I believe is still doing this kind of journalism, was living or spending a lot of time with the family in a housing project in Chicago in the late 80s, and basically following these two brothers and their family over a few years, and just documenting what happens in their lives. And I'd read it before, but it hits a little differently now. I guess every book, if you reread something, it's always going to hit a little bit differently.
Yeah.
But it's I'm definitely finding myself drawn to books that were written kind of pre-2010s. And just because the world that they capture is so, it's not entirely analog, obviously, but compared to where we are right now, it was just moving at a different speed. And maybe that's just because a millennial, of course, I'm drawn to the 90s and early 2000s. But
Sure.
It's been a good balance for my normal fiction diet of like dystopian cli-fi, which I'm having a harder time reading these days.
I recently read, in terms of dystopia, it's not quite cli-fi. I'm assuming that means climate fiction. I guess I haven't used that term before. There was a book came out a few years ago called Prophet Song, set in a near future dystopian civil war autocratic Ireland, and the kind of drivers for that and what it means, what it takes for one family to survive. And again, it's those perspectives to realize, we're not quite there yet, so maybe things aren't all horrible, all terrible all the time. Yes, and mining, it is funny because, mining those books from the 80s and 90s and the 2000s, before the kind of efflorescence of smartphones and all internet all the time, and of course now all apps all the time, it really is in many ways like visiting a foreign land. Similar themes, similar topics, in some cases similar figures and forces, in some cases which it led directly to where we are now.
Right.
But revisiting that, relearning that, and re-examining what that era held in store and what was right around the corner, of course, is maybe more important now than ever, maybe growing importance every day, or at least maybe it's just something to keep us busy between doom scrolling.
All possibilities and all valuable ones. Yeah. And I wish we had less to talk about, but here we are. I am grateful for your work and your sense making of everything happening these days. And I'm glad you've kept the faith and kept the strength to keep doing this stuff, because it is important, even when it feels like the stuff that you and I talk about, human rights, democracy, corruption, don't, not at the top of the Project 2025, let's say.
Well, to quote one of my favorite Batman movies, Adam, the night is darkest just before the dawn. And maybe it's not as dark as we can see. Maybe things will get darker yet. I suspect they probably will. And I certainly hope that there is a dawn coming at some point. Or at the bare minimum, you and I can reconvene here in a few months or a few years' time, whenever it is, and have more intellectually interesting things to talk about, even if it means the world is in a little bit worse place. Because you got to look for those advantages and those silver linings where you can. And, again, try to have conversations that are worthwhile. So I appreciate you having me on today to talk about some of these things.
Good place to end. Thanks again, Casey.
All right. Thanks, Adam.